The wind scoured the ridge like an unkind hand, dragging curtains of snow sideways across a sky the color of bleached bone. Jedediah Cole rode slow, the chestnut gelding's breath pluming in the brittle air, each hoof punching through powder that had swallowed the trail since yesterday. His scarf was stiff with frost, and the wool-lined gloves on his hands could not keep out the bite. Still, his grip was steady, one arm cradling a loaf of cornbread wrapped in faded flour sackcloth, the other holding a glass bottle of fresh milk, its pale surface beading with ice. The climb to Willow Bluff was longer in winter, not because of the miles, but because of the silence. Up here, wind replaced birdsong, and the only sound of life came from the leather creak of his saddle. Every gust seemed to question him. Why here? Why her? He didn't answer, not to the wind, not to himself. The cabin came into view as he rounded a stand of bare aspens. Smaller than he remembered, it leaned slightly under the weight of a patched, uneven roof. A single ribbon of smoke curled from the crooked chimney, fragile against the endless white. Jed swung down, boots crunching through crusted snow, the porch sagging beneath his weight as if it had been waiting too long for company. He knocked once, firm, deliberate, the sound muffled by the storm. For a moment there was nothing, and he thought perhaps no one would come. Then the door shifted inward a finger's width, and a narrow band of shadowed eyes appeared. Maya Holloway. She didn't startle, didn't smile. Her gaze was level, almost measuring, as though she were weighing him against some private scale. Behind her, the room was dim. Bare plank walls, a narrow bed sagging in one corner, the faint crackle of a fire trying to hold its ground. Cold spilled out into the space between them, the kind of cold that lived in the bones of the house. Jed didn't speak. He set the bundle on the threshold, the milk bottle catching a weak glint of light. For a breath, they stood like that, the wind pressing at his back, the warmth of the room resisting it. And in the middle, her eyes on his face without giving anything away. Snow clung to his coat collar. The scent of wood smoke clung to her hair. Without a word, she nudged the door shut, the latch clicking softly, leaving him alone again with the wind's hiss. He stood there a moment longer than he needed to, staring at the wood grain of the closed door, feeling the stubborn pulse of something unspoken. Then he turned, swung into the saddle, and headed back down the ridge. He knew one thing with certainty. Tomorrow, he would return. The second morning came in under a sky as flat and hard as hammered tin. The frost clung to Jedediah Cole's windows, like it had been nailed there overnight. He was in the saddle before first light, his breath and the gelding steaming together in the dark. The bundle for this trip was different. A crock of wildflower honey wrapped in burlap, a pouch of coarse salt, and a strip of peppered venison jerky cured in his own smokehouse. He'd taken time to tie the burlap with an old leather thong. Not because it mattered to her, but because it mattered to him. The trail to Willow Bluff was harder now. Powder from the last snow had drifted into the ruts, smoothing over yesterday's prints until the ground looked untouched. Jed kept his eyes moving, scanning for breaks in the tree line or fresh sign of other riders. When the cabin appeared between the bare aspens, it seemed smaller still, as though winter had been gnawing at it. The ribbon of smoke from the crooked chimney wavered in the breeze, threatening to disappear. Jed swung down, the porch groaning under his weight. He knocked, firm, deliberate. The sound felt different now, as though the wood knew it was him. The door cracked, and Maya Holloway's eyes found his immediately. The wariness was still there, but it was sharpened now, like a blade honed to keep danger at bay. She looked at the bundle in his hands, then back at him, expression unreadable. He set it on the threshold without crossing it. "Brought something to sweeten the tea, if you've got any left," he said. From behind her, one of the girls, tall and slight, with hair the same color as her mother's, appeared. Her eyes fixed on the jerky, and Jed saw her swallow hard before glancing at Maya. Maya's hand touched the girl's shoulder, and the child stilled. Jed tipped his hat and stepped back. No further words. The door closed slowly, the sound of the latch muffled by the wind. It went that way for days. Day 3. Potatoes, their skins cold and rough. Day 4. A tin of salt pork, the paper wrapping stained with brine. Day 5. A sack of coffee beans, not chicory, but the real thing, dark and sharp. Each time the door opened a little wider. Each time the girls came a little closer, their eyes less guarded. By the 6th day, the younger one, Nora, stepped onto the porch with bare feet wrapped in rags, ignoring the cold to watch him tie his horse. But down in Lone Creek Valley, tongues were moving. At Coyote's den, under the haze of cigar smoke and the low murmur of poker hands, Jed felt the weight of talk. "He's after her land," a rancher muttered into his glass. "Or maybe he's just the type that can't keep to his own side of the fence," another said with a slow grin. "Either way, she's trouble. Holloway blood runs wild." Jed didn't look up, just set his whiskey down and said, quiet but clear, "A man's got to ride his own trail, even if it don't suit the map in your head." It shut them up, but it didn't change the stares that followed him to the door. On the 7th day, the sun broke through, casting the snow in a glare so bright it made the ridge look like a sheet of glass. Jed carried another loaf of cornbread, still warm, and a bottle of milk wrapped in wool. Maya was on the porch before he dismounted. The wind played with the loose ends of her shawl. She didn't move toward him. "You don't have to keep coming," she said over the crunch of snow between them. "I know. I can manage." "I reckon you can, but till you do, I've got more than I need." They stood like that, eyes steady, the air between them holding more than the words had said. She took the bread, her fingers brushing his glove, a small contact, but one that stayed with him the whole ride home. That night, Jed sat at his kitchen table, staring at the lamplight sliding across the grain of the wood. His place was warm, stocked, solid, but it felt hollow in a way that had nothing to do with walls. He thought of the Holloway cabin, the thin fire, the girls' quick glances, the way Maya's voice softened, just a breath, when she'd said, "Thank you." He told himself this was about keeping them alive through winter. But he knew better. Winter was just the excuse the trail had given him. The next morning, snow was in the air again, fine and sharp as ground glass. Jed was tightening the cinch when a voice came from the fence. Elias Crow leaned on the rail, rifle balanced across his arm. "You're headed up there again." Jed gave the cinch strap a last pull. "She's got 2 young ones." Elias's eyes narrowed. "And a pride sharp enough to cut a man." "Folks are talking, Jed. Not all of it's fit for ears." Jed met his gaze steady. "I don't ride for their approval. Never did." Elias's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Then watch yourself. Snow's not the only thing waiting on that ridge." That day, halfway up Willow Bluff, Jed caught movement in the aspens. 2 men, broad-shouldered, faces hidden under slouched hats. Not hunters, not neighbors. They disappeared into the trees before he could call out. Maya opened the door before his hand touched it. "You saw them too," she said. He nodded. "Keep the rifle close. It's never far." He handed her the sack, oats, beans, and a tin of dried apples. "Door barred at night," he said. For the first time, he thought he saw a flicker of trust in her eyes. On the ride down, the sun was a smear of blood over the horizon, the snow in the trees catching the light like shards of glass. The ridge no longer felt like someone else's place. It was starting to feel like ground he had a stake in, whether he'd earned it or not. And as the wind picked up behind him, Jed knew this. The next time those shadows in the trees showed themselves, he'd be ready. The wind carried a different smell that morning, pine pitch and wood smoke, but under it, the faint tang of iron. Jedediah Cole had been riding the west long enough to know that smell meant fresh work with metal, a trap, a forge, or a rifle barrel recently cleaned. He climbed Willow Bluff slower than usual, scanning the timberline. Out here, the land had its own language. A crow's sharp call from the south slope could mean a deer spooked or a man moving where no man should be. The aspen stood bone white against the snow, their bark etched with old initials from cow hands, passing through in better seasons. At the cabin, Maya was outside with an axe, her breath clouding in the cold. The younger girl, Nora, was stacking kindling, while Elsie carried a bucket from the spring. Jed swung down. "Morning," he said, the brim of his hat dipping. Maya straightened, her eyes scanning past him toward the slope. "They were back last night," she said, low enough the girls wouldn't hear. "Didn't come close, but I heard horses in the trees, more than one." Jed's jaw tightened. "Mining boys?" Her look said she didn't need to answer. He spent the day nearby, helping fix a split rail in the corral. The West wasn't just open country and wide skies. It was a constant act of holding the line against everything that wanted to take it from you. Out here, a man's skill with a hammer could matter as much as his skill with a Colt. While they worked, Maya told him about her mother's people, the Lakota, how the old women still hung medicine wheels in the rafters to keep bad spirits away, how they marked the change of seasons by the moon shape rather than a calendar. She spoke of gathering chokecherries in summer, of boiling spruce tips in spring for a tonic. Jed listened, the steady rhythm of the hammer in his hand matching the cadence of her voice. He'd spent most of his life drifting between towns, never staying long enough to learn their roots. Hers went deep. Late in the afternoon, a sound rolled in over the snow. Hoofbeats, slow and deliberate. Jed's head came up, and Maya froze, the axe still in her hand. 3 riders emerged from the aspens, their coats dark, hats pulled low. They didn't speak, just reined in 100 yards from the cabin. One of them, broad shoulders, a scar running from his jaw into his collar, tipped his hat in a gesture that wasn't quite polite. Jed stepped forward, the snow squeaking under his boots. He didn't draw, but his hand rested easy near his holster. "Afternoon," the scarred man called. "Fine day for riding." Jed's voice was flat. "Fine day for keeping distance, too." A pause, then a grin from the rider. "Just checking on a piece of land some folks say is coming up for sale." Maya's voice came from behind Jed, steady as a fence post. "It's not." The man's smile faded. "Things change." He turned his horse, and the 3 of them rode off slow, making sure. Their tracks were plain in the snow. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of cornmeal mush on the stove. Jed closed the door and set the latch. "They'll be back," he said. Maya poured coffee, real coffee from the sack he'd brought days ago, into 2 tin mugs. "Then we'll be ready." He took the mug, the heat seeping into his fingers. In the West, readiness ain't a thing you talk about. It's a thing you prove when it comes calling. She met his eyes over the rim of her cup. "And what are you proving, Jedediah Cole?" He didn't answer right away. The fire popped, sending a shadow across her face. "That I'm not the kind of man who rides away from trouble when it's parked on a friend's land." Something in her expression eased, though she didn't smile. That night, he stayed in the barn. The wind worked its way through the cracks in the boards, carrying the smell of horses and hay. Jed lay on his bedroll, listening to the gelding shift its weight, to the distant creak of the cabin door when Maya checked the latch. Out here, a night could stretch on forever, the darkness as thick as tar. But when morning came, the frost would sparkle on every rail and branch, and a man would remember why he stayed. The next day, Jed rode into town for supplies, nails, lamp oil, a new whetstone. At the mercantile, talk stopped when he walked in. Western towns had their own unwritten law. They didn't need a sheriff to let a man know when he was being measured. One miner at the counter muttered something about free meals for pretty widows, and the air went taut. Jed didn't look at him when he said low and even. The West remembers the shape of a man's back, whether it's bent to help or turned to walk away. The miner shut his mouth. On the way back, the sky turned the deep, bruised purple that meant snow was coming hard. Jed pushed the gelding up the ridge, the cold biting at his ears. When he reached the cabin, he found Elsie on the porch with her mother's rifle, the barrel resting on the rail. "They're back," she said. Maya stepped out, shawl tight, eyes on the slope. Jed followed her gaze. The same 3 riders waited just inside the tree line, silhouettes against the white. They didn't move. The West had rules for this too. Sometimes you faced a man in the street at noon. Sometimes you waited him out until the cold or his own doubt made him leave. This time the riders turned after a long minute, their horses fading into the timber. But Jed knew that was just the first round. The first flakes came just after dusk, slow and heavy, drifting through the air like scraps of paper from a burned letter. By the time Jed finished tightening the barn latch, the wind was beginning to howl up the ridge, slamming into the cabin's walls. Inside, the fire glowed low but steady, the room smelling of pine resin and cornmeal mush. Maya moved with deliberate efficiency, shutting the shutters, checking the door latch twice. The girls were already under quilts in the loft, their voices drifting down like the sound of sparrows. Jed set his saddlebag down near the hearth. "This is the kind of night men use to settle things," he said. Maya glanced up, her eyes holding his. "We'll be ready." He nodded, but his mind kept turning over the image of those riders, watching from the timber. They weren't going to sit out a storm like this. An hour later, the sound came, dull thuds under the wind, the crunch of hooves over frozen snow. Jed moved to the window, careful to keep his shadow from showing. Lantern light from the barn wavered, then vanished. "They're in the barn," he said quietly. Maya reached for the rifle propped in the corner, her movement smooth, practiced. Jed's voice was low, almost a growl. "They think the weather's their ally. It ain't." The wind slammed against the door, rattling it in the frame. Then, faint but clear through the storm, came a voice, deep, carrying the cold in it. "Maya Holloway, we just want to talk." Jed's jaw set. "Talk's cheap in a storm like this." They didn't come through the front. The first crash was at the side wall, near the root cellar hatch. Jed swung the door open and stepped out into the white roar, snow whipping into his eyes. Shapes moved in the swirling dark. 3, maybe 4. Then he saw the twist. One of the shapes wasn't a miner. It was smaller, lighter on its feet, and it wasn't moving to attack. It was moving toward the house. Jed caught a break in the wind and saw her face. Nora. She wasn't running from them. She was running with them. The sight stopped him cold for a half second, and that was enough for one of the miners to swing a length of chain toward his head. Jed ducked, drove his shoulder into the man's gut, and sent him sprawling into the snow. Another came from his left, a pick handle raised. Jed's fist caught the man across the jaw, sending him into the drift. The wind swallowed his curse. Nora had reached the porch, fumbling at the door latch from the outside. Maya's voice rang sharp from within, but the blizzard tore the words away. Jed grabbed the girl's arm, pulling her into the lee of the cabin. Her eyes were wild, not scared, but guilty. "They said they could bring my pa back," she blurted, the words tumbling out. "Said they knew where he was." The realization hit Jed like a hammer to the chest. The miners weren't just after the land. They'd found the one lever that could crack this family open. From the inside, he dragged Nora inside, slamming the door against the wind. Maya's face went pale when she saw her daughter, then hardened when she caught Jed's look. "They're lying," Maya said flatly, but her voice trembled. Jed loaded the rifle with hands that moved faster than his thoughts. Lies are cheaper than bullets out here, but they can cut just as deep. The pounding on the wall started again, this time with a rhythm. 3 hits, pause, 3 hits. A signal. Jed pulled the door open a crack, just enough to shout into the storm. "You want the land, you'll have to freeze with your boots on it." No answer, just the wind and the hiss of snow. Then, faintly, the sound of retreating hoofbeats. They didn't sleep that night. Jed kept the rifle across his knees, eyes on the door. Maya sat at the table, the lamp between them, her hand resting on Nora's shoulder. "They'll be back," Jed said. Maya's gaze didn't waver. "Then we won't be the same when they come." Outside, the wind screamed over the ridge, carrying the miners' scent back down into the valley. Inside, the 3 of them sat in a circle of light, the unspoken truth heavy between them. This was no longer just about land. It was about a promise, and the price a man was willing to pay to keep it. The blizzard broke at dawn, leaving the ridge under a sky so sharp and blue it hurt to look at. Snow lay clean and deep over the valley, erasing all but the freshest tracks. And there were plenty of those. Hoofprints cut across the bluff, circling the cabin, leading down toward the creek. Jed was outside before the sun cleared the pines, scanning the prints. "They left fast," he said, crouching to study a deep impression where a horse had stumbled. "But not far." Maya stood on the porch, shawl pulled tight. "You're going after them." He didn't answer, just looked up at her. She read it in his eyes and nodded. "Then don't go alone." By mid-morning, Jed was riding with 3 Lakota horsemen, their ponies moving sure-footed over the crusted snow. At their head was Chaska Two Feathers, the old man's braid tied with strips of red cloth that fluttered in the cold. "You came for the Ochethi Shakoving," Chaska said in his low, steady voice. "A man who gives his word stands in the circle. We ride with him." Jed nodded, keeping his eyes forward. The West had its own language of loyalty, and sometimes it came without asking. They tracked the riders to a stand of black spruce near the frozen creek. Smoke from a low fire curled between the trees. Jed swung down, his boots sinking into the drift, the rifle in his hands heavy and certain. The miners were there, 3 of them, same as before, but this time they weren't smiling. One sat sharpening a bowie knife, the scar along his jaw pulling tight with each stroke. Another paced near the horses, breath steaming. The third crouched by the fire, his eyes flicking up at the sound of snow crunching. "Morning, boys," Jed called, voice flat as sun-baked clay. The scarred man rose, knife in hand. "You brought company." "I brought what's mine to bring," Jed said. "You've been circling a place that doesn't belong to you. That stops here." The standoff stretched, snow drifting between them. Then the man by the fire spoke, his tone oily. "She didn't tell you, did she? Her man's still alive." Jed felt the Lakota shift beside him, the snow creaking under their moccasins. He kept his voice even. "I've heard that lie already." The man smiled. "Not a lie. He's digging for us up north. We could bring him back, if she gave us the ridge." Jed took a step closer, rifle steady. "The West's got rules. One is, you don't barter with another man's kin. The other is, if you try, you don't walk away standing." What happened next was fast and sharp, like a rattler striking. The scarred man lunged. Jed's rifle butt caught him under the jaw, sending him sprawling in the snow. Chaska's pony snorted as 2 Lakota riders swung in, bows drawn. The third miner broke for the horses, but a warning shot cracked into the drift ahead of him. When the dust, or in this case the snow, settled, the miners were on their knees, hands clasped behind their heads. Jed stood over them, breathing hard, the cold burning his lungs. "You tell whoever sent you," he said, The ridge is spoken for. You set foot there again, the snow won't be the only thing burying you. By the time they rode back, the sun was low, painting the valley gold. Maya was on the porch, the girls at her side. When she saw the riders, her shoulders dropped in a way that told Jed she'd been holding herself tight all day. Chaska dismounted first, handing Maya a small pouch. "For the hearth," he said. "Keep it burning." She opened it. Inside was a twist of dried sage and a strip of red cloth. "I will," she said quietly. Jed swung down, the snow crunching under his boots. "They won't be back," he said. Maya looked at him a long moment. "You didn't have to do this." "Maybe not," Jed said. "But I reckon there's more to living out here than keeping your own boots dry." That night, the cabin felt warmer. The fire snapped, the air rich with the scent of the sage Chaska had given her. Outside, the wind moved softly through the pines, no longer carrying the edge of threat. For the first time since he'd come up the ridge, Jed let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was a place he could stay. If you were in Jed's boots that morning, knowing the storm had barely passed and danger was still close, would you have ridden out or stayed behind the safety of the fire? The thaw didn't arrive so much as creep. An inch of mud at noon that froze hard again by dusk. A single drip from the eaves that grew into a steady tick, tick, tick against the porch rail. The ridge, which had spent weeks speaking only in the voice of wind and snow, found a second tongue. The quiet, patient language of water. Jedediah Cole woke to that sound in the lower, friendlier crackle of a fire that didn't have to fight for its life. He rolled from his bedroll in the barn, dusted hay from his coat, and stepped into a dawn glazed with thin light. His breath no longer hung like smoke. It was a good morning for building. He walked the side of the cabin with a length of twine, measuring the wall the way a man reads a map, palming the knots he'd tied 6 feet apart, translating them to lumber in his head. "If I set a sill here," he said to no one, "and frame a window under the eave, you could watch the ridge turn gold." Elias Crow's boots crunched behind him. The old hunter had a way of moving that belonged to the woods, slow but always there before you expected it. Talking to the boards now? Talking to what they'll be. Elias squinted along the wall, thumb grazing a split in the log. "You're putting down roots, son. Roots don't ride easy if you ever have to leave." Jed looped the twine back into his pocket. "I'm not planning to leave." "Plans are cussed things," Elias said, eyes going to the timberline where the miners had stood days ago. "The world don't often read 'em." Jed didn't answer. He had lumber to fetch. By mid-morning, the sled he and Elias had dragged from town groaned with cedar rails, a crate of nails, and a square of salvaged window glass wrapped in old newspaper. Maya met them on the porch, shawl loose, hair braided back. She'd slept, Jed realized. It took him by surprise how much larger that made the world feel. "What is all this?" she asked. "Walls that don't rattle when the wind gets a mind," Jed said, setting the crate down. "And a window to catch the light." "You don't have to," she began, then stopped, the line between her brows softening. "All right, if we're doing it, we do it right." She took the other side of the crate without ceremony. Elsie and Nora peered from the doorway, the older girl with a spool of twine in her hand, the younger clutching a tin cup like a talisman. Nora wouldn't meet Jed's eyes. Her cheeks still carried the washed-out look of someone whose heart had been used as a lever. Jed tipped his hat to her. "We'll need a runner for nails. That job takes a steady hand." Elsie straightened. Nora's fingers tightened on the cup, then loosened. "I can do it," she said, voice small but trying for firm. Maya nodded once, approval wrapped in caution. "You both can, if you listen." The morning settled into rhythm. Out here, work smoothed the hard edges of a day better than any whiskey. The West rewarded what you could put your back into. Jed cut the sill, the saw's teeth singing in steady strokes. Elias shouldered a pry bar and coaxed stubborn logs to give a little without splitting. Maya marked studs with charcoal, her lines true, her jaw set in that way Jed had come to recognize, a gate built for storms, not strangers. The girls fetched nails, counted them into a tin lid, recounted when Elias made them start over. The smell of cedar climbed into the air, resin bright as a promise. Every few minutes, a swallow of cowboy coffee passed from calloused hand to calloused hand. It tasted like grit and sun and the will to see a job done. Around noon, Chaska Two Feathers appeared at the edge of the yard, as quiet as if the trees had poured him out. He carried a small bundle wrapped in red cloth. "For the new room," he said to Maya, placing it in her palm. "Hachoka, center place. You decide where. Burn the sage when the first night comes." Maya bowed her head. "Pilamaya, Chaska." "Thank you." Chaska's eyes slid to Jed. "You hold to the circle still?" Jed met his look without flinching. "I do." "Then build straight," the old man said, and his mouth creased, a smile or the memory of one, and he was gone into the timber again. They framed the rough opening by mid-afternoon, when Jed lifted the wavy pane of salvaged glass and set it against the light. The world beyond wobbled like a mirage, pines tilting, sky bowed. He caught Maya watching that warped horizon, and for the first time saw in her not just vigilance but hunger, for a view that wasn't just a search for danger, for a square of future cut right out of the wall. They set the window. The first nail rang bright against the cedar, the second too. On the third, the hammer glanced. Jed's knuckles kissed wood. He hissed through his teeth. "Hold," Maya said, and her hand wrapped his wrist before thought. Her palm was warm. Her grip was as sure as any splint. They both went still, longer than the moment required. Jed felt the air tighten, felt something in his chest loosen in answer. He stepped away first, not because he wanted the space, but because space was the honest thing to give. "We'll brace it," he said, voice too even. Elias cleared his throat loud enough to be heard in the next county. "Stud there," he announced to no one, then set about finding anything to hammer that wasn't a heart. By the time the light went amber, the frame was up, the corners trued, and the glass set. The new room was no bigger than a stall, just enough for a bed and a trunk, but it changed the cabin's posture. A house that had been cinched tight against the world had added a rib, a breath. They ate on the porch steps, corn cakes warmed on the stove, a jar of chokecherry, preserves Chaska's sister had traded last fall, and jerky Jed had sliced so thin the afternoon sun could nearly pass through it. The girls licked red from their thumbs and counted cloudbirds, drifting west. It might have ended there, in the good quiet way of a day well spent. But the West rarely let a day finish exactly where you wanted it. Elias saw the rider first, a dot on the lower trail, then a man in a coat city cut enough to look wrong against this line of country. He rode a bay that pranced more than traveled. Dust, no, not dust, a film of thaw mud painted the mare to the knee. Maya rose without a word. Jed stood too, the porch step complaining under his boot. Elias's hand found the easy curve of his rifle, but he didn't lift it. The rider drew up 20 yards out and doffed his hat with fluency that had never met a real storm. "Mrs. Holloway," he called, his vowels long and smooth as creek clay. "Name's Whitlock. I represent the Caledonia Mining Concern." Jed didn't like the way the man's eyes slid past the new framing, ticking off measurements that weren't his to take. "You can turn that horse around, Mr. Whitlock," Maya said. "This ridge is not for sale." Whitlock smiled as if she'd complimented his boots. "I respect a decisive woman. I came to deliver word, not to bargain. Your husband, Amos Holloway." Something in the air changed. Even the blue above seemed to look down harder. "Is alive." The word didn't echo. It just sat there, heavy as ore. Nora made a sound like a cork coming out of a bottle the hard way. Elsie's hand found her sister's without looking. Maya didn't move. She seemed to pull stillness into herself the way a tree pulls water. "You'll say anything to pry up a deed," she said. The sentence was perfect. Only her fingers betrayed her, closing once, hard, around the fabric of her skirt. Whitlock inclined his head. "Your caution does you credit, but I have a letter." He pulled an envelope from inside his coat, its edges stained with the brown of travel and something darker. "Signed by one Amos Holloway. He works our North Pit, contracted term. His return can be arranged, upon amicable settlement." Jed didn't reach for the letter, didn't want his hands on anything that felt like a leash. "Miners we spoke to didn't leave with their teeth," he said. "You offering the same message with better penmanship?" Whitlock's eyes flicked to Jed, weighing him the way surveyors weigh a hill before they cut it. "I speak for my employer, Mr. Cole." "Mr. Cole, this is a family matter. Perhaps you'd let the lady decide without." Maya spoke over him, her voice calm enough to set dishes by. "You can leave the letter on the rail. If it is my husband's hand, I will know." Whitlock dismounted, the bay sidestepping with expensive impatience. He placed the envelope gently on the rail, as if afraid the wood would bite. "I'll return tomorrow for your answer," he said, remounting. "A woman shouldn't have to choose between a roof and a husband. Caledonia prefers to solve two problems with one. Kindness." "Kindness," Elias repeated, tasting the word like it might be poison. Whitlock tipped his hat. "Good evening." He turned the bay, and the show animal picked its way down the trail like the ridge was a parlor rug. No one spoke until his figure bent out of sight into the lower aspens. Then the cabin seemed to exhale all at once. Maya lifted the envelope. Her fingers didn't tremble. She slid a knife under the flap with a motion that was all housecraft and no ceremony, and drew out a single sheet. The girls leaned close, but not too close. Jed looked at her face instead of the paper. Faces told truer stories. Her eyes tracked the lines once, then again, slower. She didn't weep. She didn't smile. She handed the letter to Elias. "Read it." Elias held it at arm's length, then nearer. Age had thieved a step from his sight, but not his caution. He cleared his throat. "Maya, if you receive this, know that I am not dead. The men I fell in with sold me onto the mine north of Bear Tongue. I signed for term to avoid hanging on a charge I didn't earn. I can get free if I pay the balance. Caledonia says they'll speak fair with you about the ridge. Tell the girls their daddy thinks on them every night. Amos." The page crackled when his hand tightened. Ink's old, but not too old. Hand looks practiced, but tired. "Where'd they get it?" Jed asked. "Either they have him," Elias said, "or they have a good liar." Maya took the letter back. She didn't hold it to her chest like a prayer, or throw it in the fire like a curse. She folded it once, precisely, and slid it into her apron pocket. "We eat," she said. "Then we talk." They ate. The stew was thin but hot. The bread a little stale but honest. The girl spoke only to pass salt, then to ask to leave the table early, which Maya allowed with a nod. When the loft ladder creaked under their feet, the room shrank to 3 adults and a question that filled every inch. Maya laid both hands on the table. "I'll say what you already know," she began. "If Amos is alive, I don't owe those men anything for telling me. I don't sell an acre to fetch him home on their leash." Jed waited. Her voice had that iron vein in it again, the one that carried a house through winter and 2 girls through a bad year. "But I'll also say what you're not going to. He is the girl's father." She looked at Jed when she said it, did not flinch. "If there's a path to bring him back that doesn't cost our souls, I'll walk it." Jed nodded. "Then we find the path without paying their toll." Elias scratched his jaw. "That mine north of Bear Tongue, there's talk. Men sign short-term and come out long if they come out. There's a man at the trading post. Met a runner from there once. Runner liked to talk when whiskey liked him. If Amos is under contract, there'll be a ledger. Ledger can be stolen, Jed said. Ledger can be copied. Elias's eyes cut to Jed. Or burned. It doesn't fix the weight on Maya tonight, Jed said. The room shifted then, emotion moving under the floorboards like groundwater. Maya's face changed, not hardening, not softening, but going clearer. I need to speak plain, she said to Jed. Since you first knocked on our door, you've given more than I asked. I am grateful. The girls are alive because of it. But I won't swap one kind of dependence for another. If I must walk north to fetch Amos myself, I will. The words shouldn't have stung. They did. Not because she'd cut him, she'd done him the courtesy of truth, but because some part of him had already set his saddle inside this house and called it home. He looked at his hands on the table, scar over knuckle, old nail bed split turned white. He could pull a man from a drift, mend a fence, stand against three with a rifle butt and grit. But there were fights you couldn't win with your back. You won't walk north alone, he said, careful to leave the possessive out of it. I don't know what I am to this house, yet, but I know I'm a man who doesn't watch good people get ground up because someone rich found a hinge on their hearts. Maya held his gaze until holding it wasn't a contest anymore. She nodded once, thin as a blade. All right, she said. We fetch proof. We fetch help that isn't bought. And if any man comes here again with a price on our grief, he won't find our door. Elias's chair creaked. I'll go to the post at first light, see what paper can be found. Chaska might know a trail runner who carries messages for coin, not companies. Take the gray, Jed said. She's sure-footed in thaw. They rose from the table into a room that felt both heavier and more right. The girls were already asleep in the loft, breath twinning through the slats like a hymn. Maya crossed to the new room and stood in it without crossing the threshold, as if stepping into a promise too soon might break it. Jed took his hat from the peg. I'll check the corral. Jed, he turned. Thank you, she said. For building with your hands and not your mouth. He tipped his brim. Boards remember the hammer that set 'em. So do people. Outside, the sky had gone velvet dark. Stars salted the cold in constellations he'd never bothered to learn and suddenly wanted to. He walked the fence, palmed the rails one by one. A night bird made a sound like a drawn bow. Somewhere in the timber, a fox stepped soft over a fallen limb. The ridge breathed. He had just reached the barn when the argument hit him from the cabin like heat. Not words, Maya's voice too low for that, but the shape of it carried on the air. The edge wasn't for him. It was for the girls. He didn't step closer. He didn't need to hear to know. Tonight would be the first of many nights the Holloway women argued with the idea of a man who wasn't there and with the man who was. In the West, love rarely arrived as a clean sheet carried to a clean bed. It came like winter comes. Hard, then kinder, then hard again, until the ground knows which roots will stay. When he went back inside, the lamp was turned low. Maya stood by the window he'd set, looking out into a darkness that reflected her own face back at her, faint and doubled. He left before the first snow, she said, not turning. Said he had to ride with a crew for one last haul, and we'd be set. He kissed the girls and said men do hard things for the ones they love. He didn't say some hard things aren't the right ones. Jed didn't offer comfort wrapped like advice. He had learned some silences were stronger than reassurances. He stood shoulder to shoulder with her and looked through glass that wobbled the stars. Tomorrow, he said, we get paper. Day after, we get eyes on that mine. We pick the ground we'll fight on. She nodded. And if the paper says he's there? "Then we fetch him," Jed said. "But we fetch him as free people, not as a debt paid with our home." Her mouth quirked, not a smile exactly, but a line that knew where it would be if the world ever gave it permission. "You talk like a man who's already chosen." "I have," he said. "I choose the side with the fire we built." He left her there with the new window and the stars and rolled his bed out by the hearth. The cedar smell of the new room mixed with sage and coffee and the stubborn sweetness of choke cherry. He closed his eyes to that, and for the first time since the ridge had taken up space in his mind, slept deep. Near morning, in that thin seam of night, where dreams tangle with the truth, he woke to a sound that wasn't the house settling. Hoofbeats, soft and careful, on thaw-soft ground. He rose, without his breath changing, and moved to the window. A single rider ghosted along the lower trail. No lantern, no hurry, like a man who already knew the map he meant to draw. Not Whitlock, bigger in the shoulders, slower in the mind, or better at hiding it. Jed could never tell at a distance. The rider didn't look up, didn't check the cabin, didn't stop. He headed north, toward Bear Tongue. Jed's hand found the window frame he'd set that afternoon. The wood was still warm from daylight. He felt absurdly like the house itself had braced its shoulder beside his. Dawn edged the ridge. In that gray, almost light, Elias's silhouette crossed the yard toward the corral, already moving to saddle the gray. Inside, the girls stirred, their small feet thumping the loft boards. In the doorway of the new room, Maya stood with Chaska's red cloth in her hand. "Burn it when the first night comes," Chaska had said. Jed nodded to himself. First night had come. The second would too. And between them, they'd build something that could take the weight of a letter, a lie, and a man whole enough to be worth bringing home. The morning broke sharp and clean, the air carrying that rare scent of pine needles warming in the first sunlight. Snow still clung to the shadowed hollows, but the ridge itself had begun to breathe again, a slow thaw seeping into the ground. Maya's cabin, once a weather-beaten shell, now wore new shingles, mended shutters, and a fence that stood straight and proud. Fresh pine poles ringed the yard like sentinels, and just beyond them, the Lakota camp had pitched in a loose half-circle, protection as much as kinship. Jed stood on the porch, his black coat brushed and shoulders squared. Chaska Two Feathers moved beside him, adjusting the eagle feather at his own braid. "You ride for more than yourself today," the old man said, eyes steady. "A man who takes a wife takes her burdens, and her enemies." Jed nodded once. "I reckon I knew that the first time I climbed this ridge." By midday, the yard had filled. Lakota elders in beaded vests, settlers in their Sunday coats, a handful of ranchers Jed had ridden with over the years. Even Elias Crow was there, leaning on his cane, his eyes flicking to every shadow. Maya emerged from the cabin, wearing a simple calico dress the color of cream, her hair braided and tied with a strip of red cloth. Lakota custom, offered in friendship. Her daughters clung to her hands, their boots crunching over the frosted ground. A hush settled as she reached Jed. The preacher, a lean man with wind-burned cheeks, opened his Bible and began the words. The vows were short, but in the West, words carried the weight of iron. "I will keep the fire," Maya said, voice low but certain. "I will keep the roof over it," Jed answered. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, a slow creak of leather came from the edge of the crowd. 3 men sat their horses beyond the fence, miners, their coats dusted with trail snow, faces expressionless. Jed's eyes met theirs. No one spoke. The preacher went on. When the last amen fell, Chaska stepped forward, holding a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in tan deer hide, lay a single eagle feather and a twist of sweetgrass. "Carry this into your home," Chaska said, "so its walls remember why they were built." Maya took it with both hands, bowing her head. Jed touched his brim in thanks. The crowd began to break into knots. Settlers greeting Lakota, women passing plates of fry bread, venison stew steaming in tin bowls. The air was rich with the scent of coffee, sage smoke, and pine pitch. It might have been perfect, if not for the man who approached from the fence. He was older, stooped a little, wearing a coat slicked from years of hard rain. In his hands was a ledger, its leather cover worn smooth. "Jedediah Cole," he said, his voice carrying just enough for the closest few to hear. "This was found in the mining company's office after their foreman cleared out. Thought you ought to see it." Jed took the book, feeling the weight of it heavier than it should be for paper and ink. He flipped it open, scanning the neat columns of figures. Then he stopped. "Maya," he said, and there was something in his tone that made her step closer. Her name was there, written in a tight, formal hand, beside a line of numbers. Land value, estimated output, and a notation. Option secured. Conditional. The crowd's easy chatter thinned. Elias leaned in, his voice a gravel whisper. "Means they had a claim on this place, if certain conditions were met." Jed looked up at Maya. "You knew?" Her eyes flickered, just once, before she squared her shoulders. "I knew they'd been after the land since before." She stopped, glancing at the girls. "But I didn't know about that ledger." One of the miners beyond the fence smiled, slow, deliberate, and tipped his hat. Jed closed the book and handed it back to the old man. "Paper burns," he said, "and claims die if no one feeds them." He turned to the preacher, to Chaska, to the crowd. "This ridge stays with the ones who live on it. Anyone who thinks otherwise can try the trail and see where it ends." A murmur of agreement rolled through the settlers and Lakota alike. The miners turned their horses, riding off without a word. As the sun slid behind the pines, the yard filled again with laughter and the clink of tin mugs. But the ledger's weight stayed in Jed's mind, even after it was gone from his hands. Marriage in the West was never just about love. It was about who stood with you when the wind rose, and who might stand against you, ledger or no. If you were at that fence line, watching a man marry into a fight he didn't start, would you have spoken your objection, or held your tongue? The wind had turned cold again by nightfall, the kind of cold that doesn't howl but whispers, sliding through cracks, testing the shutters, licking at the seams of a man's coat. Inside the cabin, the wedding stew pot still hung over the hearth, the scent of venison and sage clinging to the air. Maya had put the girls to bed, their breathing soft beneath the quilt. Jed sat at the table, running a whetstone along the edge of his knife, the slow, even scrape filling the quiet. Elias dozed in the corner, Kane leaning against his chair, his hat tipped low. Chaska had ridden back to the Lakota camp after dark, but promised to keep watch from the ridge. The knock came just after midnight. 3 slow raps, deliberate. Jed rose, every motion measured. His hand didn't go to the rifle by the door. It stayed loose, ready for whatever walked in. When he pulled the door open, the cold rolled in, and with it, 2 men. Not strangers, miners he'd seen before, but without their third. Their coats were dusted white, their faces raw from wind. "We ain't here for trouble," one said, holding his hands out. "Just talk." "Talk's free," Jed said. "But you pay for the walk up here, so say it quick." The taller of the 2 stepped forward, eyes cutting toward the back room where the girls slept. "This land. She can't keep it. Ledger or not, you know it. Winter's coming back, and the mine needs the water from that creek. You could save her the fight, Cole. Walk away now, and there's gold enough for you both." Jed leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, studying them like he might study a pair of snakes he wasn't sure were dead. "You rode all this way in the dark to make a man an offer you could have made in town." The man's jaw tightened. "In town, you'd have to answer in front of others." Elias stirred in the corner, "If you're making offers," he rasped, "make 'em where folks can see your hands." The miners ignored him. "Think about it, Cole. You've got no blood here. Just a widow with 2 mouths to feed and a patch of dirt the snow's gonna bury in a month. You could ride south, start over somewhere warmer." Jed's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "There's a saying out here. A man's boots are where his word is. Mine are on this ridge. That's the answer." The shorter miner's face shifted, something mean flickering in his eyes. "You think she told you everything? You think you know what she did to keep this place when her man didn't come back?" Maya's voice came from the shadows behind Jed. "Enough." She stepped into the light, hair loose over her shoulders, eyes steady. "I buried my husband with my own hands. I've patched this roof in a storm, cut firewood till my fingers bled, and boiled creek water when the snow turned it black. If you think you can scare me out of what I've kept this long, you've mistaken your trail." Something shifted in the air, part challenge, part warning. The taller miner hesitated, then reached into his coat. Jed's hand dropped to the Colt at his hip, the hammer easing back with a click that sounded loud as a church bell in the quiet. The man froze, then pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "This is the last offer you'll get." Jed didn't take it. "Leave it on the step." The miner set it down, eyes holding Jed's for a heartbeat too long. Then they turned, their boots crunching into the frost as they walked off into the night. Jed closed the door and slid the bolt. For a long moment, the only sound was the pop and hiss of the fire. Then Elias said, "You reckon they're riding back to camp?" "No," Jed said, picking up the paper. "I reckon they're circling." He unfolded it. Inside was no offer, just a rough charcoal sketch of the cabin, an X drawn over the back window. By the time Chaska returned from the ridge, Jed had the Lakota posted in a loose ring around the yard. They waited in the dark, the snow glowing faint under the quarter moon. The attack came an hour before dawn. A shout from the tree line, the thud of boots in snow, and then the crack of a rifle from the shadows. Jed answered with a shot of his own, the muzzle flash lighting his face for an instant. Lakota arrows hissed through the dark, finding their marks. One miner went down in the drift, the other 2 breaking off towards the creek. Jed followed, breath burning in his lungs, boots punching through the crust. He caught the taller one at the frozen bend, dragging him down into the snow. The man swung wild. Jed's fist met his jaw, with a sound like a green branch snapping. The miner spat blood, teeth pink in the moonlight. "Ain't over, Cole. Ledger or no ledger, you'll never keep it." Jed hauled him up, shoving him toward Chaska's men. "Then I guess we'll just have to keep saying no till you hear it." When the last of the shadows melted from the ridge, the sky was paling in the east. Maya stood in the doorway, the girls at her side, wrapped in blankets. Jed walked back up through the trampled snow, the Colt heavy at his side. He looked at her, and in that quiet between breaths, they both knew. The fight had changed shape, but it wasn't gone. If you were offered the chance to walk away from a fight like this, with gold in your hand, but knowing what would happen to those left behind, would you take it, or stay in the cold? The first light came slow, sliding between the black ribs of the pines, brushing the snow with a faint gold. Smoke curled from the cabin chimney, thin and straight in the still air. A sign the wind had finally laid down. Jed stood at the fence line, one boot on the bottom rail, eyes scanning the valley below. The trail the miners had cut in the night was already half hidden by drift. Out here, the land had a way of erasing men who didn't belong. Elias joined him, limping slow, a mug of coffee steaming in his hand. "They'll be back," he said. Jed took the coffee without looking away from the horizon. "Maybe, but they'll find the ridge waiting." Behind them, Maya stepped out onto the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The girls followed, each clutching a strip of sweetgrass from the Lakota gift. "You should sleep," she said. Jed shook his head. "Not yet." She came down the steps, boots crunching the frost, and stood beside him at the fence. For a moment they just watched the valley, the way the sunlight touched the creek bend like it was blessing it. From the Lakota camp came the sound of a drum, slow, steady. Chaska had told him it was a song for keeping what was earned. The rhythm carried over the snow, through the pines, into the bones. "Your boots still where your word is?" Maya asked, a faint smile ghosting her lips. Jed let out a slow breath. "Right here." He could have left, could have taken the gold, headed south where winters were a whisper, and men didn't have to fight for every fence post. But the ridge wasn't just dirt and timber anymore. It was a promise. First message, hidden in the choice. Some ground is worth standing on, even when it costs you more than it pays. The sun cleared the tree line, throwing light into the hollow where the miners had stood at the wedding. It turned the snow to a glare, erasing the prints, making the land look untouched. Jed knew better. Every scar, every post, every stone in the chimney was a mark left by someone who refused to leave. Second message, hidden in the land's memory. What you build with your hands will outlast the noise of those who try to take it. Elias tapped his cane against the rail. World's got a short memory, Cole. Men forget who stood where. Jed glanced at him. Then we remind 'em by keeping the fire lit. Maya reached over, her fingers brushing his. Not holding, not asking, just letting the touch say what didn't need words. Third message, hidden in the quiet touch. Sometimes the strongest bond isn't shouted. It's kept in the steady work of two people facing the wind together. The drumbeat faded back into the morning stillness. Jed finished the coffee, set the mug on the fence post, and turned toward the cabin. Inside, the fire needed tending, the stock needed checking, and the day's work would start like any other. But as he stepped through the door, he felt it. The ridge was his now. In a way, no ledger could mark and no gold could buy.